Welcome to Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Measuring Success Right. I'm your host, Tim Kelleher. Today's guest is Whitney Kingsolver from the Ballard Brief. Whitney Kingsolver is a junior studying environmental science and sustainability. She also has 2 minors in international development and global and community impact. She is preparing to apply to graduate school this fall. Whitney is from Utah and enjoys hiking, reading, and paddleboarding in her free time. Whitney, thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So how is school going this semester?
It's going well. I've been dealing with knee injury, and I just recently got knee surgery. So it's been a lot, but other than that, the semester has been good, just focusing on school and work and stuff.
Have you been taking any classes this semester related to the topic in your Ballard Brief?
Yeah, I've been taking a class on plant physiology and international health, so both kind of related to my brief.
Awesome. And hopping into the Ballard Brief, how did you initially hear about the Ballard Center?
My mom told me to take the Do Good Better class, and you gotta listen to mom, right? So I took the class and I learned about it from there.
And can you explain the Ballard Brief to those who haven't heard of it before?
Yeah, so it is a research database for social issues. So students have the opportunity to write about a social issue that they're passionate about and then get it published on the website.
And what's the research process behind getting a Ballard Brief published?
So generally, students take 1 semester of Do Good Better social impact class, and they write an issue brief, which is kind of a rough draft for Ballard Brief, and then they do an additional semester where they work with 2 editors to finish it, polish it, and make it even better. So it's about a year of really intense research and writing and editing, and then it becomes a Ballard Brief.
Can you tell us when your Ballard Brief was published?
It was published the first week of this year, I think, in January.
So you've been working on it since 2021, to say.
Yep.
So quite a while.
Yeah.
And what exactly is the research process behind it?
It's a lot of just Googling things, finding databases like through the BYU library or a Google Scholar, and just trying to find leads and then following the data where it goes and trying to figure out what the research means and if it backs up, the other research you found, and a lot of reading.
A lot of reading, and then it comes together as a Ballard Brief.
Yep.
Can you explain to us your topic, introduce it for us?
Yeah, so the official title is Effects of Plastic and Waste Pollution on Ocean Communities in the Asian Pacific Region. So it's all about the big problems of waste pollution in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Thailand, that area, and why plastic is really bad.
And how did you find out about this topic and find out that you were interested in it?
So I got interested in environmental sustainability and that kind of thing when I was in high school. It was when the big first don't use plastic straws, that big thing came out, and I got interested in it, and that's how I got into my major. And I always thought that the plastic pollution problem was really bad here in the United States, but then when I was doing research, I realized it's so much worse in other countries. So I wanted to learn more about that and how our actions have an impact on countries across, oceans, and see what we can do about it.
So it's fair to say that the Asian Pacific region is one of the most affected regions by plastics.
Mm-hmm.
But it affects the entire world too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What countries are part of the Asian Pacific region?
So it's a huge region, all of Southern Asia and then kind of the Pacific Islands. In the brief, I mostly focus on India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand. but it encompasses a ton of countries. But those are the countries that have the most data. So that's what I focused on.
And when did this initially become a concern for the Asian Pacific region?
Plastic production really skyrocketed in the late 1960s, kind of is when it really started. But most people didn't notice that it was a problem until the 90s or early 2000s because it hadn't accumulated yet. And then right around that time is when it got like, oh, this is going to be a big problem eventually.
So starting then, and then now it has become an even bigger problem.
Yeah.
I have a statistic here from your ballot brief, and I was hoping you could explain it for us. It says more than 3,000 families live in landfills in the Asian Pacific region.
Yeah, so in a lot of these areas, they have big landfills that kind of take over cities. Here, like in Utah, there's a landfill down kind of by the lake, but I don't think anyone really thinks about it. It's down there, it's far away. But in these areas, it takes over communities because so much waste is accumulating. And so sometimes people get jobs as scavengers in the landfills, and they just permanently move there and live in the landfill because either they can't afford to live somewhere else or it's just easier, and the waste is just there. It's everywhere. And so they just live there, and it's not a good living situation, as you could imagine. But yeah, more than 3,000 families.
So what are some of the consequences of living so close to a landfill?
Some of the consequences of living in landfills are that obviously there's a lot of things in waste that we don't think about that eventually decomposes and it releases a lot of gases, or nothing smells good. There are bacteria and viruses that live in it, so you can get really sick from living in a landfill. Additionally, there are chemicals that leach from plastics. So a lot of plastics, when they break down, chemicals come out and then they leach into the ground. They get into groundwater, and then it's just kind of contaminating everything around them. So you get really sick. You can have chemicals in your food and your water, and some women have to give birth in the landfill, which, as you can imagine, isn't safe at all for a baby. And so, you might have birth effects or maternal mortality, that kind of thing.
And in these countries, are there sustainable alternatives to the plastics?
There are some alternatives coming out. They're kind of more of a new thing. There's some really interesting research about using like seaweed algae packaging because it functions similar to plastic, but then people can just eat it or it decomposes pretty easily. And so that's one alternative that's coming out, but it initially is more expensive to produce, get it started, and then just places haven't adopted it yet. Plastic is pretty cheap, and so it's just easy, and it's in systems already, so people don't want to change. So there's not a ton in mass markets or in really poor areas, but there are new products coming out, and that's encouraging.
And going off that and related to the consequences of plastic, what does plastic do to the fishing in these countries?
So plastic floats. You've probably heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's just like a floating patch of trillions of pieces of plastic. This isn't exactly in the same area, but the same thing happens on the coasts of these countries. So when plastic is floating, it's harder to fish because you think you're pulling up a bunch of fish, but you just get a bunch of plastic. Also, fish don't want to be around plastic. It's harmful to them. There was one study that pulled out a bunch of fish from the ocean and tried to see what their diet was, and a lot of them, their stomachs were full of plastic. And so if you are fishing those fish, they're full of plastic, that's not good for you, and the fish aren't going to be good for tourism or recreation or for food. So it definitely has a big impact on fish in that way. Also, with the chemicals that I mentioned before, it can disrupt ecosystems, and so some fish, it disrupts their growth hormones and that kind of thing, and so they won't be the normal sized fish, or maybe they don't finish growing, they die prematurely, and so that can affect the types of fish that you can access.
And not only does it affect the fish, it also affects the humans who eat the fish, who would essentially be eating plastic.
Yeah, so plastic goes up trophic levels. So if you eat something that's eaten plastic, you get it inside you too. So, and just as plastic isn't good for fish, it's not good for humans either.
And this gets us to the term microplastics. Can you explain to us what are microplastics?
Yeah, microplastics are just small pieces of plastic. It's generally 2 millimeters to 0.05 millimeters, I'm pretty sure. And then nanoplastics are even smaller than that. In the ocean especially, there's waves, there's currents. Plastic gets broken down pretty quickly, and so you might think that it's totally clear water, but it's full of these really tiny plastic particles. With nanoplastics especially, you can't see them without a microscope or something, so it's hard to see that. Obviously fish can't see that, and so they eat things and they get a bunch of microplastics, and that's not good.
And beyond the microplastics, plastic also contributes to global warming. Can you explain how that process happens for us?
First of all, plastic production releases a lot of greenhouse gases, which are gases that contribute to the greenhouse effect or global warming. They just kind of get trapped in the atmosphere and warm things up. So plastic production releases a lot of greenhouse gases in factories and that kind of thing. And then when plastic is breaking down, it releases other chemicals. So in landfills, methane is a really common
gaseous product.
Yeah. Methane is a big product from landfills, and that's a greenhouse gas that has a lot of power to warm things up. So those are two ways that it contributes to climate change.
And then can you explain for us the concept of global waste trade?
Yeah, so some countries don't have enough infrastructure to take care of waste, so they don't have enough landfills or they don't have recycling facilities, that kind of thing. What can we do to get rid of the waste? Some countries don't have enough to deal with that, with how much they're producing, and so they ship the waste to other countries in hopes that they will process them. But it's not always perfect. The United States has a lot of infrastructure to take care of waste. Obviously, we produce a lot, so it's not enough, but we do have a lot of infrastructure. But just for simplicity, we do ship a lot of waste out and to other countries. And for a while, China was a huge acceptor of plastics for recycling. But in 2018, I'm pretty sure, they said, okay, we're not taking any more. And so other countries had to pick it up. And so a lot of these countries in the Asian Pacific region started taking it in. So the Philippines, Indonesia, India, those countries, Malaysia, they started accepting it, but they didn't have the infrastructure to keep up with it. And so it kind of starts accumulating. And it's not just the United States that participates in this. It's countries in Europe, it's countries in Asia and Africa, all over the world. And it ships all different places, but the Asian Pacific region is a big acceptor of it.
And it's interesting to note, this is organized trade. This is not just like through the ocean. It is the U.S. saying, hey, we would like to give you our plastics.
Yeah, it's huge freight boats. I think is what they're called. And they just have containers full of trash. And that sometimes poses another question or another problem, because when all this waste is being transported across the ocean, frequently one of these huge containers can just fall off a boat or something, and then all of that waste just is floating in the ocean. So transporting is sometimes an issue. There's also been some problems with countries smuggling waste that they shouldn't be. Sometimes like dangerous waste, you're not supposed to transport that, because then you're just making the other country deal with it. But sometimes they smuggle things in like that, and then the other country has to deal with it. It's just like complicated, and it's an issue between a lot of countries.
So that is the organized trade of waste.
Yes.
Getting back to the not organized waste, what steps have been taken to remedy the pollution problem in the Asian Pacific region?
The biggest thing has been encouraging the creation of material recovery facilities, or MRFs. These are facilities that can be small or huge that take care of waste. They process recycling, or they organize it and clean it and get it ready to be recycled. And so some organizations focus on just getting plastic out of the ocean, which is great, but it's hard to mitigate the problems if you don't process the waste. If it's just sitting on land, then it can affect humans, and then it can get into the ocean again. So a big focus has been on creating the facilities that can actually process the waste and recycle things and get things in landfills and that sort of thing.
So it's fair to say that efficiency is a big problem with these
Yes.
material recovery facilities.
For example, the biggest landfill in Jakarta, which is a huge province in Indonesia, it accepts 7,000 metric tons of waste daily, but it can only process 100 metric tons each day. And so that's thousands of tons of waste that are just waiting to be processed. And so getting that infrastructure going and making it so it can process thousands more, that could help mitigate the waste problem.
Yeah, and that's just one example, and that's the largest, right? So if they have a problem, it's likely that many others face similar issues.
Many of the small provinces don't have any MRFs, and so they don't have any way to process the waste, so it just collects.
And going off this, we have another statistic related to this. It says waste collection programs rarely reach entire cities, and they frequently leave 20 to 50% of waste uncollected.
Mm-hmm. So even if a small province does have a waste collection program that is supposed to go pick up trash or recycling or sort things, it doesn't get everything, because there's only so much funding to go around. And so sometimes entire neighborhoods just don't have any way to get rid of their waste, and so it collects in the community, or they take it somewhere else where it collects there, and it just never gets processed.
So to improve the situation, what do you think needs to be done?
I think increasing these MRFs is a really good way to go. Once we have those processes, then we can focus on cleaning up the existing waste. Litigation is a big part. If countries can create better laws to make processing, recycling, or waste mandatory, then more waste will be taken care of. And also just increasing funding for programs like this. Some communities just don't have the funding, and so if governments can try and make it so that each community at least has an MRF or has some way to process the waste, then that will help. And then also just reducing plastic production. If there's less plastic being produced, then we can focus on what already exists.
And then is there any current legislation in countries, maybe in the U.S. or in these countries in the APR, that is aimed at reducing pollution?
Yeah, a lot of these countries do have programs that they're trying to get started. In the Philippines, they're trying to create some MRF programs that will be better at reaching communities outside of big cities. So they have that that's getting started. And then Indonesia, also a leader in Indonesia announced that they are working really hard to try and improve these processes and make it so there's not as much waste gets accumulated. And then in the US, there's definitely some things going around trying to get something started. In Utah, there's a law that no one can ban products like styrofoam or plastic. So that's kind of a step backwards just because it's making sure that plastic can't be banned. But there are some other places that are doing a really good job of mitigating the pollution.
What can an individual do to improve the pollution problem in the Asian Pacific region, but also in their home country?
First, in our home country, I think just trying to use less plastic products is the best way to start. If you just choose products that don't have a lot of plastic in them, then you're not contributing as much. Supporting companies that choose to have sustainable packaging instead of plastic is always a good way to go. And then trying to avoid single-use products like straws, which everyone knows is a big marketing campaign, but other things like plastic wrap or plastic bags. There are really great sustainable alternatives that already exist and they're cost effective. So just switching to those kind of products is always a good idea. And then encouraging being an active voter and encouraging politicians to make the changes so that plastic isn't the norm and that we want to see more sustainable products. That's another good way to try to help in the Asian Pacific region. If we make it the norm that plastic products aren't in every industry, then it transfers over. And other than that, just supporting politics, international development, that kind of thing to try and get the MRFs going.
And I want to take a look at one country that is part of the Asian Pacific region that has been able to relatively avoid some issues, and that's Australia. Can you explain to us what the situation looks like in Australia related to pollution and how they're able to solve their pollution problem?
Australia is in a similar location to a lot of these Asian Pacific countries, and they also have plastic problems with oceans. But they have been able to create a lot of programs that process plastic pollution, and that has been able to push through way more plastic to be recycled or in landfills to be taken care of. And this has had really good results. Once they made a landfill bigger or they made their facility bigger, they've been able to process way more plastic, and it's helped make plastic pollution go down significantly.
So it's fair to say that the solution already exists and that somebody has proven it can be done. It's just a matter of implementing it in these other countries.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Australia does have a lot more funding for these programs, and so when funding is available, they can make these programs and it helps solve the problem. So it's just a matter of getting the money and implementing it.
All right, so now switching away from your Ballard brief, can you answer for me how you balance your work and research responsibilities with your family and religious responsibilities?
That's a good question. I find that a lot of it overlaps. Particularly with religious responsibilities, I always feel that we as Latter-day Saints have a responsibility to care for the earth. We have stewardship over it given to us, and it's our responsibility to take care of it. And so I find that doing this kind of research, learning about the environment and what we can do to help solve issues like this, that lines up exactly with my religious beliefs. And then with relationships, I think surrounding yourself with people that are passionate about the same things as you are. And then work, I am really lucky to work in the Ballard Center, and so I'm always surrounded by people that are really passionate about social issues. I'm constantly learning from everyone, and we all help each other grow a lot. And so I think it really goes together really well. And just managing research responsibilities sometimes you get sucked in, and I wouldn't think about anything else for hours and hours, but it's always good to take a break. And sometimes it feels like there's no solution to these issues, and just remembering that it's just one step at a time. It's what helps me.
And then do you have any advice for other college students who are maybe just graduating?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm in that boat. But I think that just finding a way that you can contribute to bettering your community is always a good way to go. No matter what your job is, you can always include an aspect of social impact, whatever work you're in, and just make it so that you can make the world a little bit better wherever you go.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And our last question is, how do you measure success in your life?
I try to make goals, little goals and big goals, and I think that I feel most successful when I can accomplish those. Just little goals like I'm going to get through this week, or I'm going to get this assignment done, and then big goals like I want to graduate soon and that kind of thing. So just focusing on goals is how I measure success.
Well, thank you for being with us here today, Whitney.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening to this week's episode. Please check out our other episodes, and we'll see you next week.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about measuring success right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review, or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.